Reading the Times for Friday, March 6th, 2020. Almost without precedent, airlines hit hard by coronavirus. On Thursday, Lufthansa Group, whose airlines include Lufthansa, German Airlines, Swiss Air, and Australian Air, started putting in place a widespread reduction in services that will cut capacity by about 25%. The airline had previously said it expected revenue for the quarter to climb between 3.5 and 5.5%. On Wednesday, United Airlines announced plans to cut international service in April by about 20% and domestic service by about 10%, while JetBlue said it would reduce service temporarily by about 5%. Elizabeth Warren, once a front-runner, drops out of presidential race. In 2016, some progressive organizations mounted Run, Warren, Run campaigns, and her eventual presidential rival, Mr. Sanders, floated her name as a possible challenger to Hillary Clinton. But Miss Warren resisted the urge to run then. Here's my advice. Cast a vote that will make you proud. Miss Warren told voters on Super Tuesday, speaking in Detroit, during debates ahead of the votes in Iowa and New Hampshire, two states where Miss had invested many of her presidential hopes. She took a backseat to other candidates like Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar. Was it always going to be the last man standing? That's the view shared by many of the female candidates who struggled to explain it. After the year of the woman, no woman remained as a serious contender to the nomination. In her remarks on Thursday, Miss described talking about sexism as the trap question for every woman, forcing female candidates to either look like a whiner or deny a reality widely known to about a bazillion women. Over the course of her nearly 14-month bid, she came to address gender more directly, attacking Michael R. Bloomberg for derogatory comments about women, accusing Mr. Sanders of lying in his denial that he told her a woman was not electable in 2020, and describing the discrimination she faced during one of her pregnancies. Judge calls Barr's handling of Mueller report distorted and misleading. Mr. Barr could not be trusted, Judge Reggie B. Walton said, citing inconsistencies between the Attorney General's statements about the report when it was a secret and its actual contents that turned out to be more damaging to President Trump. The differences between the report and Mr. Barr's description of it caused the court to seriously question whether Attorney General Barr made a calculated attempt to influence public discourse about the Mueller report in favor of President Trump, despite certain findings in the redacted version of the Mueller report to the contrary, wrote Judge Walton, an appointee of President George W. Bush. Mr. Barr's public rollout of the Mueller report has been widely criticized. Judge Walton's decision focuses on the period last spring between the delivery of the Mueller report to the Attorney General, his publicly issued summary of it 2 days later that drew widespread condemnation, and the release of the report itself a month later that revealed several discrepancies between the documents. As Bernie Sanders pushed for closer ties, Soviet Union spotted opportunity. The mayor of Burlington, Vermont, wrote to a Soviet counterpart in a provincial city that he wanted the United States and the Soviet Union to live together as friends. The New York Times examined 89 pages of letters, telegrams, and internal Soviet government documents, revealing in far greater detail the extent of Mr. Sanders' personal effort to establish ties between his city and a country many Americans then still considered an enemy, despite the reforms being initiated at the time under Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet General Secretary, while Yaroslavl documents show the Soviets to be planning a propaganda effort in Burlington. Mr. Kaska, the Sanders campaign spokesman, said the reality was different when the Yaroslavl delegation arrived in Vermont in October 1988. Reporting at the time is clear. Rather than propaganda, officials on both sides discussed the limitations of the Soviet system and their common desire to avoid nuclear war, Mr. Kaska said. It's pure panic, wrenching wait at nursing home where coronavirus took hold. The hardest day of Debbie de Los Angeles' life had been the day she put her mother into a nursing home, as fatal infections spread through the Life Care Center in suburban Seattle, where her 85-year-old mother lived. Miss de Los Angeles had tried not to worry. Miss de Los Angeles, 65, said that her mother, Miss Maureen, had never wanted to move into a nursing home. Putin and Erdogan reach an accord to halt fighting in Syria. Neither Russia nor Turkey wants an open war, but the meeting is likely to send an important signal about how far the Russian leader is willing to back off in Syria so as to patch up relations and pursue what, in the long term, is more important Russian goal of dividing NATO. At the start of talks in the Kremlin on Thursday afternoon, Mr. Putin avoided any criticism of Turkey over its support of terrorists in Syria, Russia's word for rebels fighting the Syrian government, and instead offered Mr. Erdogan his condolences for Turkish soldiers killed in recent fighting in Idlib province. The full text of what was agreed to in Sochi has never been made public, but the agreement was widely seen as an attempt by Mr. Putin to cement a partnership with Mr. Erdogan that has done so much to divide and rattle NATO. Dmitry Trenin, the director of the Moscow Carnegie Center, predicted that Mr. Putin would try to keep on an even keel with Turkey. After the failed 2016 coup in Turkey, he said Putin thought, "This guy is tough and unpredictable and not a nice person to deal with, but I help him in big way." He remembered. That hope, he added, has gone now. For Putin, loyalty is most important thing. ICC allows Afghanistan war crimes inquiry to proceed, angering U.S. The decision on Thursday is the first involving American forces by the court, which was established more than 15 years ago to seek justice for victims of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Having spent years collecting information on the Afghan war, Ms. Benzoda requested permission to open an investigation into claims of war crimes and crimes against humanity attributed to the United States military and intelligence forces, the Taliban, and Afghan forces. The prosecutors authorized to commence an investigation into alleged war crimes committed on the territory of Afghanistan since May 1st, 2003, as well as other alleged crimes that have a nexus to the armed conflict in Afghanistan, said Piotr Hofmansky, the presiding judge of the appeals panel. Violence in India threatens its global ambitions. If India loses the secular democratic identity, then it loses what makes it different than other countries in Asia. We are all watching the riots in Delhi and worry they are going down a dangerous road that makes it harder for us to be a stronger advocate for India, said Representative Ami Bera, a California Democrat who is the longest-serving Indian American in Congress. Now, though, none of the Western world leaders who have sought closer partnership with India have yet to issue strong warnings about the sectarian violence in India, at least publicly. More criticism is coming in. On Tuesday, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights filed its petition in India's Supreme Court to challenge the Citizenship Act, claiming the law undermines the country's human rights obligations. India's foreign minister has asked the Supreme Court to overturn it. From the Afghan peace deal, a weak and pliable neighbor for Pakistan. More than 18 years later, and after years of secret machinations by Pakistani spy service to help equip and finance the Taliban, the fragile deal brokered last weekend holds the promise of an ideal outcome for Islamabad, a weak and pliable neighbor that Pakistan can influence long into the future. Yet regional experts warn that Pakistan risks playing a dangerous game if the American military withdrawal leads to a further descent into chaos, fueling a full-scale civil war in which India, Russia, and others back different factions and dragging Pakistan into a protracted conflict. The intelligence agency's support for the Taliban strained and eventually ruptured America's relationship with Pakistan, a longtime ally that the United States saw as a bulwark against Soviet expansion during the Cold War. And yet, American leaders wrestled with just how much to push Pakistan to cut ties to the Taliban, worried that pressure from Washington could undermine the military's grip on the nuclear-armed country and lead to an Islamist takeover of Pakistan. Dubai ruler imprisoned his daughters and threatened one of his wives, UK court rules. The ruler, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, has been under scrutiny since the allegations emerged in late 2018 that the daughters, Sheikha Latifa Mohammed Al Maktoum and Sheikha Shamsa Al Maktoum, had each tried to escape their restricted lives only to be abducted and returned to the house arrest in Dubai, the gleaming financial hub of the United Arab Emirates. According to the court documents, it was Princess Haya who asked Mrs. Robinson to meet Sheikha Latifa in December 2018, a move that ultimately did more damage to Mrs. Robinson's reputation than to assuage concerns about the Sheikha's well-being. The princess told the court she had already begun to harbor doubts about Sheikha Latifa's treatment, despite her husband's reassurances that the Sheikha was not stable and she was bipolar. Oil bonanza plunges Guyana into political crises. Exxon started production in December, and although the payoff in 2020 will be a trickle relative to what it will come, it is expected to elevate oil incomes this year to a third of all government revenue, surpassing all of the country's traditional exports combined. According to the IMF, by the end of the decade, the country's output will reach 1.2 million barrels a day, according to the estimates by the oil consultancy Rystad. That would mean Guyana's production would overtake the current output of its neighbors, the declining oil giant Venezuela. The company began exporting crude from Guyana's first deepwater well, located 120 miles off the country's coast, in January, 5 years after making the initial oil discovery. Some in Guyana worry that the government's preoccupation with oil is already displacing resources from the country's traditional industries, sugar, rice, bauxite, and gold, which are the country's largest sources of employment. When Voyager 2 calls home, Earth soon won't be able to answer. On any given day, NASA communicates with an armada of spacecraft in deep space. Because Voyager 2 is considered a geriatric spacecraft, losing contact with it for any length of time is risky. While the team won't be able to command Voyager 2, they will be still listening to the spacecraft. Shinzo Abe, Japan's political Houdini, can't escape coronavirus backlash. Public health officials, not Mr. Abe, became the face of government ineptitude when a troubled quarantine of a cruise ship led to hundreds of infections on board and the risk of further cases on shore. Yoichi Mazuzoi once served Mr. Abe as health minister and headed Japan's fight against the 2009 swine flu pandemic, which killed dozens in the country, said the government's handling of the outbreak had been so disastrous because Mr. Abe has stayed too long in power. Over the past year alone, a pair of cabinet ministers had resigned. Mr. Abe's government had been accused of destroying records related to the possible misallocation of public funds. At least 2 members of his party had been linked to bribes from a Chinese gambling company, and prosecutors railed the offices of a close political ally over allegations she violated campaign finance law. Doctors say UK is ill-prepared for coronavirus. 4 doctors already dealing with the overflowing wintertime wards. There was little faith that even the most ambitious plans could keep the National Health Service from being deluged by a crisis that strikes where it is weakest, a severe shortage of beds for critically ill patients, which puts it behind much of Europe and has alarmed doctors for years. Doctors are counting on intensive care units coordinating closely as the crisis mounts to ensure the sickest patients have beds. Britain has already shed roughly 160,000 hospital beds since the late 1980s, as doctors shortened recovery times and tried to reduce reliance on hospital care, mirroring efforts across Europe. 2,773 people are under quarantines in New York City. A man in his 40s and a woman in her 80s are the latest people in New York State to test positive for the coronavirus, according to several reports Thursday morning. That brings the total number of confirmed cases in New York to 13. Mayor Bill de Blasio announced New York's latest cases during an appearance Thursday morning on MSNBC's Morning Joe. The first confirmed case in New York was announced by state officials on Sunday. Coronavirus in New Jersey, a second positive test in the state. The State Department of Health said it was waiting for a more detailed analysis by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention to confirm presumptive positive results. But the presence of the virus in New Jersey would bring the total number of states with patients to 17. The patient went to the emergency room at Hackensack University Medical Center on Tuesday and presented symptoms that made the hospital staff believe he could be infected with the coronavirus, said Dr. Danielle Varga, the chief physician executive for Hackensack Meridian Health, which operates the hospital. Dr. Varga said the patient was in stable condition on Wednesday night. Dr. Varga said the 5 to 6 patients have been tested for the coronavirus during the past 5 days, but only one had tested positive. Nurses battling coronavirus beg for protective gear and better planning. If nurses aren't safe, then really our community isn't safe, said Jenny Managebi, a clinical nurse at the University of California, Davis Medical Center, where 24 nurses were asked to self-quarantine after a patient tested positive for the virus. At Evergreen Hospital in Washington, where at least 7 deaths have occurred, nurses who were told to self-quarantine were later asked to return to work, according to the Washington State Nurses Association, raising fears that they could further spread the virus if they had contracted it. The California Nurses Association, a statewide union that has grown into the largest organization of nurses in the country, with representation of 155,000 nurses, is scheduled to hold a news conference Thursday afternoon to demand access to the highest level of protection for nurses on the front lines. With thousands trapped on board, cruise ship awaits coronavirus test results. A cruise ship with thousands of people on board was being held off the coast of California on Thursday after officials learned that a patient who died from the coronavirus had previously traveled on the vessel, and that some passengers and crew members on board were showing symptoms. The virus circulated among the more than 3,700 crew members and passengers who were waiting out the 2-week isolation period in the port city of Yokohama, with nearly 700 cases identified from the ship. The company said in a statement that health officials had identified a group of less than 100 passengers and crew members on the Grand Princess to be tested before arriving in San Francisco. How worried should you be about the coronavirus? At the same time, a pandemic means that virtually everyone could face unusually high health care, child care, and elder care burdens. If you live someplace with good governance, along with plentiful health care and economic resources, the risk to you is likely to be lower. For many of them, the systemic risk of a coronavirus outbreak is possibly about on par with the health risk I faced with my own illness, unpleasant and disruptive, but probably far from catastrophic. Fed officials says central bankers are aligned in coronavirus response. Tuesday's phone call between G7 finance ministers and central bank governors, the subsequent statement and policy actions by central bankers are clear indications of the close alignment at the international level, Mr. Williams said in a speech to the Foreign Policy Association. The Bank of Japan and European Central Bank, which already have interest rates set below zero, have yet to further cut borrowing costs, but they have pledged to support their economies. The New York Fed president, whose Reserve Bank is partly responsible for ensuring financial markets are functioning properly, also promised that the Fed stood ready to act as needed to make sure that everything is working smoothly. Flood the streets. ICE targets sanctuary cities with increased surveillance. If you've got the facts and you've got the probable cause, get the judge to sign the order, she said, adding, if that happens, then there's no choice. But we're not going to do it simply on the basis of an ICE agent's signature in a world in which ICE has become highly politicized. In New York, the Immigrant Defense Project, an immigrant advocacy group that monitors ICE activity, said it has received about 80 reports on ICE enforcement actions in the first 2 months of 2020. Mark Morgan, the acting head of Customs and Border Protection, played down the decision to deploy border agents with tactical training to help with street arrests, saying that just a handful would be sent to sanctuary cities and they would play only a supporting role, using the same methods as a typical ICE agent. NASA's Mars 2020 rover gets new official name, Perseverance. The next NASA rover headed to Mars, up to now blandly referred to as Mars 2020, has been named Perseverance.
If you think about it, all these names of past Mars rovers are qualities we possess as humans. We are always curious and seek opportunities. We have the spirit and the insight to explore the moon, Mars, and beyond. But if rovers are to be the qualities of us as a race, we miss the most important thing, perseverance.
NASA has previously landed 4 rovers on Mars successfully. No other country has accomplished that feat, although the Soviet Union and China have landed rovers on the moon. 2 jurors voted to spare Nathaniel Wood's life. Alabama executed him. In Florida, a legal battle over the role of jurors in determining death sentences ascended to the United States Supreme Court, which struck down parts of the state's capital punishment system, 2016. The state Supreme Court reversed its previous decision, with the majority asserting that in the earlier ruling, the justices got it wrong. The decision created the potential opening for state lawmakers to consider reverting to the former standard. The death penalty has been on the decline in the United States, with 7 states carrying out 22 executions last year, the second lowest number since 1991. Schumer, criticized for blasting justices, regrets the words, but not the message. Under fire from President Trump and Republican senators who accused him of threatening 2 conservative Supreme Court justices, Senator Chuck Schumer said on Thursday that he should not have used the words he did on Wednesday in a fiery speech, warning of the consequences of their rulings. Mr. McConnell's scolding came the day after Chief Justice John G. Roberts, Jr. issued a rare statement in which he denounced Mr. Schumer's remarks as inappropriate and dangerous. Mr. Trump later joined the chorus of criticism, accusing Mr. Schumer on Twitter of making a direct and dangerous threat to the U.S. Supreme Court and saying any Republican who made those remarks would be arrested or impeached. Mr. Schumer said the courts would most likely curtail abortion rights. Because Senate Republicans have confirmed nominees, they believe they will strip away women's rights and fundamentally change this country, going so far as to deny a duly elected president the right to pick a Supreme Court justice. Jared Kushner selling stake in firm that pursued federal tax break. A spokesman for Mr. Kushner said he was selling a stake in Cadre, valued on his financial disclosure form at between $25 million and $50 million, because his involvement with the firm was complicating efforts to bring in new investors, potentially including money from abroad, given Mr. Kushner's White House work on international affairs. A spokesman for Mr. Kushner said Thursday he believed that no such conflict ever emerged and that Mr. Kushner had not played any role in managing of Cadre since he joined the White House. A spokesman for Mr. Kushner would not say how much Mr. Kushner would profit from the sale of his stake in Cadre. As Supreme Court mulls dreamers, Kushner revives immigration plan. Jared Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisors, trying to revive a broad overhaul of the nation's immigration system, anticipating that a looming Supreme Court ruling on an Obama-era program that protects young, undocumented immigrants could give the nettlesome issue new life. The immigration plan would create a new direct position to oversee the Department of Homeland Security's 3 immigration-related agencies, ICE, Customs and Border Protection, and United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. After 9 months of declining border crossings, Mark A. Morgan, the acting commissioner of Customs and Border Protection, said on Thursday that immigration authorities took 37,119 migrants into custody at the border in February, up from 36,660 the month before. In Biden's hometown, Trump says he's ready to face off against him. President Trump came to Joseph R. Biden Jr.'s hometown on Thursday and said he was prepared to run against the former Democratic vice president in November, changing gears after being mentally ready to take on Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. Mr. Trump, speaking at a televised town hall-style event hosted by Fox News, was referring to Mr. Biden's unexpected resurgence in the Democratic primaries on Tuesday, just as his campaign seemed at risk of collapsing. In a venue where 2 different Trump supporters questioned whether the president's slash and burn tone was necessary, Mr. Trump ridiculed Mr. Biden, 77, for a series of recent gaffes and repeated his insinuations that his rival's mental acuity was slipping. Republicans, egged on by Trump, scrutinized Hunter Biden as his father surges. Republicans are wielding the power of their Senate majority to intensify an election-year investigation of Hunter Biden's work for a Ukrainian energy firm, putting new scrutiny on the son of Joseph R. Biden Jr. as the former vice president reemerges as President Trump's chief rival for the presidency. In elevating questions about the younger Mr. Biden's work in Ukraine, Senate Republicans are effectively picking up where the president left off last year, when he pressed the country's leaders to investigate the Bidens, an effort that led to his impeachment in the House on charges that he abused his power by seeking foreign help in the 2020 election. For now, Republicans insist Burisma is a matter of long-standing interest, unrelated to Mr. Biden's presidential candidacy, and no evidence has emerged to suggest that either Biden acted improperly. Bernie Sanders cancels Mississippi rally, shifting focus to Michigan. The change in plans suggests that Mr. Sanders will not challenge Mr. Biden for the support of black voters in the South, a vital base in the Democratic Party, and is instead going all in on the Midwest as he tries to compete for the overlapping slice of the electorate made up of working-class voters. Mr. Biden outperformed Mr. Sanders among black voters in Virginia by more than 50 points and by 40 points or more in Texas and North Carolina. In several states, Mr. Sanders came in third among black voters, behind not only Mr. Biden but also Michael R. Bloomberg. The Amy Klobuchar exit interview. Well, in South Kakalaka, you always hope. You know you're not going to win, but you want to give it a try. You know that Pete Buttigieg was also going to endorse Mr. Biden. In his newsletter on Wednesday, Frank Bruni took stock of Joe Biden's big victories and reassessed his own priors. He was too unsteady, too old, too yesterday. How could someone so oriented towards the past sufficiently inspire Americans who are looking towards the future? Well, Biden inspired, or at least appealed to enough voters yesterday to stage one of the most extraordinary political comebacks I've ever witnessed. Andrew Yang's next move, a new non-profit organization. Humanity Forward, which will be based in New York, will focus first on a data dividend project and campaign that would fight on behalf of consumers who want rights to their personal data, Mr. Yang said. Mr. Yang said he hoped his organization will grow quickly with the help from grassroots donors and celebrities who endorsed Mr. Yang, such as the comedians Dave Chappelle and Ken Jeong. Addressing voters in New Hampshire the night he exited the Democratic primary last month, Mr. Yang promised, we'll be back soon. And Thursday's announcement provides clarity about some of Mr. Yang's post-campaign plans. Biden looks to expand staff as Bloomberg weighs how to help him. A top aide in former President Barack Obama's 2012 re-election campaign, Miss O'Malley Dillon, helped Mr. Biden in the run-up to the Nevada caucuses and worked to arrange Mr. O'Rourke's endorsement of Mr. Biden on the eve of the Texas primary on Tuesday. Mr. Biden has long had a sort of bullpen-by-committee approach to his senior staff, and longtime advisors like Mike Donnellan, Steve Reschetti, and his sister Valerie Biden Owens are expected to continue to play important roles along with his original campaign manager, Greg Schultz, and deputy manager Kate Bedingfield. As a result, Mr. Bloomberg cannot simply continue paying his campaign staff and direct them to work on Mr. Biden's behalf. Instead, an email sent out to Mr. Bloomberg's campaign aides on Wednesday assured people that everyone would receive pay and benefits at least until the end of March. Why Southern Democrats saved Biden. The site is now home to the National Civil Rights Museum, a remarkable collection that includes a replica of a firebombed bus ridden by the Freedom Riders as they traveled through the South protesting segregation in 1961. Inside the museum the other day, a woman sat down beside me and wiped away tears. Southern Democrats, particularly black Democrats, are hoping to keep the history that surrounds them in the past. If the Democrats want a nominee who's a Democrat, a lifelong Democrat, a proud Democrat, an Obama Biden Democrat, then join us, he told voters in South Kakalaka in his victory speech. Biden's rise gives the establishment one last chance. If Joe Biden wins the nomination but loses to Donald Trump in the general election, young progressives will turn on the Democratic establishment with unprecedented fury. If Biden wins the White House but doesn't deliver real benefits for disaffected working-class Trumpians and disillusioned young Bernie bros, then the populist uprising of 2024 will make the populist uprisings of today look genteel by comparison. Some Sanders surrogates are attacking Biden's skills in building coalitions as sign of evil elitism, as something only those nasty insiders do. Bernie Sanders is going for broke. Things have gotten so bad that Sanders is running an ad that attempts to portray him as best buddies with former President Barack Obama. Sanders isn't making a selective case, arguing that Obama should have been more aggressive on some fronts. Sanders, despite his last-minute attempts to link himself to Obama, is committed to a strategy of maximalism without compromise. Life in Seattle, America's coronavirus capitale. We're all at the store daily, stocking up on canned goods and paper towels, awaiting news of school closings and home quarantines. We turn on the local news. We scan the bulletins from the county public health department, listen to the news conferences held by the mayor and county executive. There's uncertainty there, too. Can the public health agencies, denuded by budget cuts, meet surging needs? Are there enough local news outlets to fully report the story? Shouldn't we all stop going to work or school now? Local leaders don't know what is going to happen either. I was part of the Weather Underground. Violence is not the answer. Determined to bring the war home, we believe that we were reflecting back onto our fellow Americans the extreme violence of the war and of white supremacy. From the president in Fox News on down to the dregs of the internet, threats, many actual acts of violence, and loose talk of civil war are tolerated, even encouraged. Where are the thoughtful conservatives willing to speak out against their movement's violence? Yes, impeaching Trump was absolutely worth it. Mr. Elson served as special counsel to the House Judiciary Committee during the impeachment of President Trump. First, as a student of presidential impeachment, one of the few given the opportunity to also be a practitioner of the subject, I know the gravity of the word alone. Impeachment. Third, just as the House Democratic majority fulfilled its duty, the impeachment proceedings shone a light on those who have failed to honor their oath of office. Not only the president, but also the Republican minority in the House and majority in the Senate. What we're not doing about the coronavirus. CDC's missteps in screening left potential for virus spread. Reports that German researchers devised a coronavirus test that was then adopted by the World Health Organization for worldwide distribution. Why didn't the Trump administration obtain the German test? We in the United States, with our flawed and initially almost unobtainable CDC test, have been contacting and spreading the virus, when all the time our hospitals and health providers could have been using the German test to protect us and research the virus. Elizabeth exit, and 2 men left standing in areas of New York City where heroin and synthetic narcotic abuse is prevalent. Prevention efforts also include outreach to children of family members of people at risk of a potential overdose. If we want to continue improving the lives of the most vulnerable among us, New York State needs to increase the pay of the heroic workers who take care of them. New York, the writer, the president, and the chief executive of the Institute for Community Living, is a former deputy commissioner at the New York State Office of Mental Health. The corner of NYC that's overrun by deer, turkeys, and feral cats. On Staten Island, the city's $4.4 million deer sterilization program has reduced the deer population by 15% to 1,737 in 2019 from 2,553 in 2017, officials say. Since the deer lifespan exceeds 10 years, the full effect of this effort will not be realized for many years, and during that time, negative impacts of an overabundant deer population will continue to occur. Cayuga Heights, a village near Ithaca in central New York, has reduced its deer population to about 10 per square mile from 125 per square mile a decade ago, since it started using both deer control measures. Weinstein undergoes heart procedure before transfer to jail. Harvey Weinstein underwent a heart procedure and was expected to be moved on Thursday from a hospital to New York City's notorious Rikers Island jail complex. His spokesman said the city's Department of Correction did not immediately respond to questions about Mr. Weinstein's condition. Mr. Weinstein is expected to be housed in the jail's North Infirmary Command under protective custody, his spokesman said. Bill de Blasio suggests black voters do not know enough about Joe Biden's record. Asked why Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont lost decisively to Mr. Biden among black voters in recent races for the Democratic presidential nomination, Mr. de Blasio suggested these voters do not know enough about Mr. Biden, remarks that some called offensive and condescending. David Phoenix, an associate professor of political science at the University of California, Irvine, said that the notion that black voters were not aware of Mr. Biden's record reflects a fundamental lack of comprehension on how black voters generally navigate politics. After pointing to some polls indicating he was running ahead of Mr. Biden among African American voters, Mr. Sanders said that it's not that I'm unpopular, but that Mr. Biden was running with his ties to Obama and it was working well. Brazen shooting from a window terrifies Manhattan neighborhood. A police officer who was helping the wounded man screamed at his fellow officers and stunned civilians to look for cover, Mr. Gonzalez said. After the initial confusion, police officers entered the building and detained a man they believed fired the weapon, the chief said. Dana Windsor, 49, who lives on West 163rd Street, said he looked out the window when he heard screams and saw officers looking for cover behind cars and panicked residents fleeing down the street. Loaded gun found smuggled into jail where Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. Federal investigators on Thursday found a loaded gun that had been smuggled into a Manhattan jail where the financier Jeffrey Epstein hanged himself last summer while awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges, officials said. The discovery of a gun in the jail, the Metropolitan Correctional Center, came amid a week-long lockdown that began with the tip that a firearm might have been introduced in the building, according to a statement from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Although a gun was found, the Bureau said the jail would remain on modified operation status to finalize searches in all areas of the facility. It's more than I imagined. Boeing's new CEO confronts the challenges. To get Boeing back on track, Mr. Calhoun said he's working to mend relationships with angry airlines, win back the confidence of international regulators, and appease an anxious President Trump, all while moving as quickly as possible to get the grounded 737 MAX back in the air. A protege of Jack Welch from his time at General Electric, Mr. Calhoun has been on Boeing's board since 2009 and was elevated to chairman late last year. Boards are invested in their CEO until they're not, Mr. Calhoun said, sitting in a dim conference room at the Boeing Leadership Center, a corporate campus outside St. Louis, where Mr. Muhlenberg's photo is displayed still prominently displayed. UAW corruption case widens as former chief is charged. Federal prosecutors have charged a former president of the United Auto Workers Union with embezzlement of union funds and other crimes, the biggest step yet in a broad investigation of financial wrongdoing by union and management officials. Before becoming UAW president, Mr. Jones headed a regional office spanning 17 states and organized union conferences in Palm Springs, California. Prosecutors contend in court filings that he and other officials spent more than $1 million in union money for extended stays in luxury villas, lavish dinners, and expensive clothing, cigars, and golf clubs. On the day Mr. Jones' home was raided, federal agents also searched other locations, including the union's 1,000-acre retreat known as Black Lake in Onaway, Michigan, the Hazelwood, Missouri office of UAW Region 5, which Mr. Jones once led, and Mr. Williams' home in Corona, California. Among the sites searched are the Michigan retreat. At the Michigan retreat was a lakeside cabin being built for the exclusive use of Mr. Williams, who led the union from 2014 to 18. Mr. Williams, who joined the union as a welder, later served as regional leader and secretary-treasurer. Workplace versus coronavirus. No one has a playbook for this. In a message to employees on Wednesday night, Amazon said it was recommending that all employees in the Seattle region work from home this month if their jobs can be done remotely. Walmart said on Thursday that its employees could travel internationally only for business-critical trips, and that it was restricting their travel to conferences and trade shows within the United States. Mr. Levin is planning to have some of his office employees work from home in the event of an outbreak. Stocks plunge again on coronavirus fears. Here's what you need to know. Stocks fell, oil slipped, and yields on government bonds slid again on Thursday. All signs that investors remain worried about how coronavirus outbreak is affecting the global economy. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries proposed Thursday that oil output be curbed by 1.5 million barrels a day to deal with the effects of the spreading coronavirus outbreak on demand. Since the outbreak began, industry share prices have fallen almost 25%, or about 5 times more than during the 2003 SARS crisis, according to the group. Facebook removes misleading Trump census ads. Facebook said on Thursday it had removed misleading ads by President Trump's re-election campaign about the 2020 census in a stand against disinformation ahead of the decennial population count that begins next week. Civil rights groups, which have been warning Facebook about the possibility of disinformation around the census, alerted Facebook to the misleading ads Wednesday evening. At first, Facebook declined to remove Mr. Trump's campaign ads on the census, according to Mr. Legume and Vanita Gupta, president of the Leadership Conference Education Fund. J.P. Morgan Chief Executive Jamie Dimon has emergency heart surgery. Jamie Dimon, the longtime chairman and chief executive of J.P. Morgan Chase, had an emergency medical procedure on his heart on Thursday, according to a memo sent to bank employees. Under Mr. Dimon, the bank has grown to be the largest in the United States with $2.6 trillion in assets and a habit of dominating its competitors, both in consumer banking and on Wall Street. Recently, Mr. Dimon has elevated 2 women who are seen by insiders as potential successors down the road. Marianne Lake, the chief executive of J.P. Morgan's consumer lending business, who served for years as the bank's chief financial officer, and Jennifer Piepszak, now chief financial officer, who formerly ran the bank's credit card business. Bernie Sanders has a problem with MSNBC. Then came Super Tuesday. Now Mr. Sanders' campaign is in final discussion with MSNBC to appear on the network for a primetime town hall before the next round of primary voters go to the poll on Tuesday, according to a person briefed on the discussion. MSNBC says the network covers the Democratic field fairly, not fawningly, and rejects any claims of anti-Sanders bias. In Las Vegas last month, Mr. Sanders' complaints to Mr. Griffin, the MSNBC president, were so animated that afterward, the senator's wife, Jane Sanders, offered conciliatory words to the network executive, according to 2 people briefed on the exchange. Maxine Waters says Wells Fargo board members should resign. When the chair of Wells Fargo, Elizabeth A. Duke, appears before the House Financial Services Committee next week, Representative Maxine Waters will have a simple message for her. resign. The committee looked into Wells Fargo interactions with regulators over a series of misdeeds the bank had disclosed since 2016, including that it spent years opening fake accounts in customer names, forcing them to buy unnecessary auto insurance, and charging them inappropriate mortgage fees. The investigation, which drew on documents from inside the bank and from regulators, found that senior Wells Fargo leaders took a cavalier approach to dealing with the bank's problems. Coronavirus will cost businesses billions. Insurance may not help. 2 years ago, Munich Re, the reinsurance giant, tried to start underwriting a new kind of insurance, one that would make a company whole if its business tanked in an epidemic. Companies typically buy a kind of coverage known as business interruption insurance as part of their property policies, which pays cash to make up for lost revenue when a business has to halt operations unexpectedly. A close relative, contingent business interruption insurance, kicks in when the shutdown is at a supplier of the insured company. Flybe, a British regional airline, stops flying. On Thursday afternoon, Loganair, a Glasgow-based regional airline, announced it would take up 16 of Flybe's routes and offered to hire some of its pilots, cabin crew, and office support crew. As a low-cost regional airline, Flybe was operating in a very competent and price-sensitive market, and it was vulnerable to rising costs, said Lucy Budd, professor of air transportation management at De Montfort University, in an email on Thursday. Mr. Braithwaite added, Flybe ran out of options and ran out of time. He warned that Flybe might have been the first airline whose collapse was sped up by the virus, but that it wouldn't be the last. A chatty auction site is taking the classic car world by storm. At last year's Monterey Car Week in California, considered a bellwether for classic sales slid 34% from 2018, according to Forbes. BringATrailer.com is emerging as a prolific market shaper, said Spencer Trenery, co-owner of Fantasy Junction, a longtime classic car dealer in Emeryville, California. Mr. Nonnenberg began blogging about cars that were listed for sale online in 2007, the year he turned 30. Before being accepted for listing, all cars must pass careful scrutiny, a process Mr. Nonnenberg calls curation. Is the mileage accurate and the ownership history known? Can a prospective seller provide a record of repairs? Does the vehicle possess rare or unusual features? Can the owner supply detailed photographs? No auto show in Geneva, but the car of the year must go on. The New York Events is also scheduled to host another ceremony, the finals of the 2020 World Car Awards. Among the 10 cars that have been shortlisted for World Car Awards were the VW Golf, the Mazda 3, and the Mazda CX-30, the Kia Telluride, and the Hyundai Sonata. The judges will also select the best car in 4 other categories: urban car, luxury car, performance car, and design. Bill would make tech firms accountable for child sex abuse imagery. The two measures come as tech companies continue to detect an explosion of abusive content on their platforms, and amid complaints that neither Congress nor the companies have been aggressive enough in combating its spread. An investigation last year by the New York Times found that many companies knew about the problem but failed to squash it, despite having the tools to do so, and that the federal government has not been adequately enforcing a previous law meant to stem the abuse. In November, as they prepared the draft bill, a group of senators, including Mr. Graham and Mr. Blumenthal, asked 36 tech companies to provide details on their efforts to combat child exploitation. Yayoda Saras, general counsel of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the federally designated clearinghouse for child sexual abuse reports, which supports the bill, said the recommendations would raise the bar for the tech companies. OPEC proposes a large cut in oil output. Amrita Sen, the chief oil analyst at Energy Aspects, a market research firm, said that Saudi Arabia, OPEC's de facto leader, hopes the Russians would sign on, but that Saudi officials were becoming impatient with Moscow's tough negotiating and relatively slight contribution to cuts. Since joining forces with OPEC's more than 3 years ago, the Russians have succeeded in pushing Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter, to absorb the brunt of production cuts while doing relatively little themselves. The Saudis are cutting more and more, and the Russians haven't cut much at all. Brushan Bari, senior director at IHS Market, a research firm, said in an interview before the current series of meetings. And that, my friends, my family, my fellow countrymen, has been reading the Times for Friday, March 6, 2020.